Many of those who think that the portrayal of God in the Old Testament can't be squared with the portrayal of God in the New have a mental image that runs something like this. In the Old Testament, God is strict, not to say simply righteous, even a bit bad-tempered, and sometimes, quite frankly, cruel. And then you come to the God of the New Testament, and it's gentle, Jesus, meek and mild, turn the other cheek, be friendly, be gentle, love one another. And thus the two pictures of God cannot be squared. They're two different religions. But I would want to argue that this is a very short-sighted, even distorted reading of both the Old Testament and the New. So that in the Old Testament, for example, there are these scenes of judgment, all right, but God is regularly described as the one who is slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. He will not always chide. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him. He's pictured by the prophet Hosea, 8th century BC, as the almighty cuckold, that is, the betrayed husband, who's actually betrayed by his people and is broken-hearted and sad and is going after her, even though she's committing a kind of spiritual adultery. In tears, turn, why will you die? The Lord has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. That's all part of the Old Testament picture of God. And in the New Testament, it is true that there is a lot of emphasis on love and forgiveness and forbearance, all to be celebrated gloriously. But on the other hand, the New Testament speaks far more directly and frequently about hell. And the person who has the greatest variety of images of hell, all of them horrifying in one fashion or another, in the pages of the New Testament on his lips, is Jesus himself. And there are some passages that are so horrific that it is hard even to read them in public. Read, for example, the end of Revelation 14. So the God of the New Testament is likewise depicted as a God of judgment, a God of justice, and who will finally hold people to account. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father, whether in fear and trembling or in repentance and joy. So instead of saying that when you move from the Old Testament to the New, you move from an angry God to a loving God, I think it's far, far closer to the truth to say that as you move from the Old Testament to the New, the picture of God as a loving God is ratcheted up. So that sometimes God is portrayed as a God of wrath and judgment in the Old Testament, but quite frankly, the picture of God as a God of righteousness and wrath is ratcheted up to hell itself. But the picture of God as a loving God, yes, they're wonderful images, but it's ratcheted up to Christ himself. And both of these themes barrel through both Testaments and only find their resolution again in the cross itself. So I suspect that the reason why some people think that the pictures of judgment in the Old Testament are much more severe than the pictures of judgment in the New is because, quite frankly, they're such naturalists that they're far more frightened of natural suffering, disaster, disease, famine, war, plague. They're much more frightened of that sort of thing than they are of hell itself. But when you take the Bible in its own terms, there is a ratcheting up of both the pictures of God's love and the pictures of God's judgment as you move from the Old Testament to the New. And no softening of either, an intensifying of both, until finally they are resolved, once again, in the cross. If you want to see what judgment looks like, go to the cross. If you want to see what love looks like, go to the cross.